wherever you are in the on the globe. So today we have Commodore Vasanji, and he will be highlighting us on the what are the claims of the ocean sovereignty and the Chinese aircraft carrier program. So uh, uh, thank you, Vasanji, for giving your valuable time and all the efforts. So yeah, you can take the floor now. So you can give a brief introduction, and then you can start uh, what your expertise on says on this. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Bandariji. Good evening and good morning to everybody. It's good to see so many people here. I'm also very happy that a lot of my naval friends are here, including the Director General, Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, Commodore Deshmukh, who was my colleague earlier, and many others who are here. So it's always a pleasure to interact with them in the presence of a naval audience. First of all, let's CSA again with this opportunity to interact with them. There's some disturbance. I think you may kindly request others to mute themselves.
Ripudamanji, can you kindly mute everybody, please? No, you also muted Vasanji also, I think.
Yeah, he muted me also, no problem. I unmuted myself.
Thank you.
So,
Okay.
so thank you, CSA, for giving me this opportunity to interact with you. We've been getting a lot of updates on the kind of activities that CSA is undertaking. I'd like to make a special mention of Dr. Adityanji, who, when we started the Chennai Center for China Studies way back in 2008, contributed significant articles. And I reminded him that he had written about various issues of India-China relations at that time. And recently, again, we uploaded another article of his, when he wrote analyzing the details of India-China relations after 75 years of being together. So as far as I am concerned, I've been in the Navy for 34 years. And last 15 years, I've been in think tanks. And I started my think tank career in Observe Research Foundation. Now I am part of the Chennai Center for China Studies as the director, and also the National Maritime Foundation as the regional director of the Tamil Nadu chapter. So without losing much time, let me come straight to the topic. I hope I'll be able to share my screen. Just give me a couple of minutes. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see that, sir.
Thank you very much. So I've been asked to speak about the claims of ocean sovereignty of Chinese, of course, and the Chinese aircraft carrier program. So what I would like to do is the first portion will be dedicated to what is happening in the South China Sea. What are the issues related to sovereignty? We also will discuss about the provisions of UNCLOS, that's the United Nations Conventions on the Laws of the Sea, and see where we stand in terms of disputes which are taking place in the South China Sea. The second part of will obviously be on the Chinese aircraft carrier program, and that would definitely be more interesting for the audience, because something that's happening in the South China Sea is already common knowledge, except perhaps some of the interpretation that you'll hear differently from different analysts. So let me proceed with my talk. So this is the infamous 9-dash line. Everybody is familiar with the area which is shown here, which is in this ellipse. So if you count them, at times you might find 9, at times you might find 10, at times you might find 11. Okay, so this is the area that we are going to concentrate on, trying to establish what these claims and counterclaims are in the South China Sea. So what has been established, particularly after the 2016 verdict by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in Hague, is that there is no legal basis for China to draw straight-based lines connecting the outermost point of a maritime feature, which are the island groups in the South China Sea. So this is what you see, and this is the verdict that's been given. Not that China cares about the verdict that's been given by the PCA. It's called the award of the PCA. So this is where we are today. Right. So from 11 dashed line, it became 9 dashed line. When did this happen? This happened in 1952 when Mao gave up the claims on the Gulf of Tonkin. It was in Vietnam. So from 11, it became 10. And so people are now looking at 9 or 10, and different people talk about whether it's 9 dash line within which we have issues or whether it's within the 11 dash. The point is, it's the area that I've shown, which has got these dots, that is the area which is of great interest to all of us. So the dashed lines mean the ocean, the islands, and the reefs, all which belong to China, and then China has sovereign rights according to its own claims. But it's discontinuous, meaning that other countries can pass through the lines freely. And indeed, after a burst of seafaring exploration during the Ming Dynasty, all of us are familiar with Admiral Zheng He, carried out many voyages, from South China Sea through Asia up to Africa. And, at that time, the size was quite phenomenal. In fact, it reminds us of the present day characteristics of the Chinese Navy. Unfortunately for China, after the Ming Dynasty, they had lost interest in the oceans. So, whatever claims were made, you can credit the Ming Dynasty for the kind of success that they had in the oceans surrounding them. So, the China's emperors largely shut their empire of the seas, and this is what has been told to us by Wang Ying, a Chinese maritime geographer. So, according to Robert Kaplan, who we know, he talks about the symbols of patriotism and nationhood when it comes to South China Sea, and the microscopic bits of earth, which little history behind them, and basically no civilians living on them. So this is one of the requirements that is there, where any island that you claim should also be inhabited, should have some water resources, etc., which we'll talk about a little later. So this is again the area to tell you who are the people who are not agreeing with the claims made by China in the South China Sea. You have Vietnam, you have Taiwan, you have Philippines, you have Brunei, you have Malaysia. And what is the conundrum that we are looking at when it comes to South China Sea? One is, why is China so interested? It knows that it has phenomenal amount of oil and gas reserves. It also is a food source because of the fish which is there. And the area which is of South China Sea is 1.5 times that of India's exclusive economic zone. So it's roughly about 3.5 million square kilometers. And we have just about 2. And it also will give them an option to work on their food security initiatives. Realize why, therefore, the maritime militia has become important. So the brobit the neighbors by aggressive reclamation, which is they have done in all these areas which I'll show you, whether it's the Scarborough Shoal, whether it is Spratly Islands, or whether it is the other, I'll show you some of those. In all these areas, the idea is to brobit the neighbors, occupy these islands if there are islands. If there are no islands, create islands, reclaim them, and create military bases. This is the template for staking their claims in the South China Sea. The military militia is nothing but the people who are now recruited to come with their fishing fleets, and they are the ones who are posing problems for all their neighbors. And of course, to complement the area dinner, so this is the strategic objective, which is once you push your threat envelope to the island chain, you find that you have created certain assets which can keep USA off its back. So this is what has been consciously achieved in the last 20 years. First by staking claim, then by changing the geographic characteristics, by having military garrisons, creating runways, and extending the range of operation of their aircraft, and also having missile silos there, so that it becomes difficult for America or any other country to approach South China Sea without being challenged. This is what is happening as far as the South China Sea is concerned. So I can see the claimants which are all shown here: China, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. So the color codes which are shown here is what is depicted in the map that I have displayed over here. So this is of course a small area which tells you where the Paracel Islands is, which is over here, which is on the top. And then of course the Spratly Islands, which is over here. And of course, I'll show you where the Scarborough Shoal is in the next map. So these are the hotspots within the 9 dash line and so identified. So every country which is there, where there are overlapping claims on the exclusive economic zone, which is actually within the 9 dash line. So there are all become hotspots, whether it's with Vietnam, whether it's with Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, even Indonesia for that matter, though it's not a direct disputant. So in all these areas, we can see an aggressive posturing of China using its navy, using its missiles, and using also its military maritime militia, which I mentioned about just a couple of minutes ago. So these are the disputes that are plenty. So what I mentioned about Scarborough Shoal is over here. You can see that that's also been taken over and converted into facilities which will support ships and other aircraft. The Paracel Islands, which is over here, and the Spratly Islands, which are over here. Once again, you can see this is the conflict area, and you can see that the Chinese claim lines are the 9 dash line, call it 10 dash line if you like to, and these are the dispute islands where there have been issues. And after bearing with all this for a long time, 2012, 2013, Philippines decided to go to quoting the UNCLOS provisions to say that China is in the wrong. And while the Philippines' claims were upheld, and not that China was bothered about it, like I said earlier, and they said we are using the same provisions of UNCLOS, of which it is both a signatory as well it has ratified. It says, I will use the provisions of UNCLOS to keep away from this dispute. So it's a question of using the law according to your convenience. So this is again important to us because all this while the PLA Navy remained a coastal navy, a coastal configuration. It's only in the last 15 years they've developed an ability to move beyond the first island chain, which is the first defense line, and the second defense line, which extends up to Japan and beyond. So this is one of the lines which is shown during the RIMPAC exercise, where the transit of the Chinese is shown here. Why this is important is that now they have the assets, nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, long-range aircraft, and even the fishing vessels, the deep-sea fishing vessels, which can foray into not just South China Sea, it also has created scenes in the East China Sea, and they also have the ability today for forward presence and posture, of which I'll talk about it a little later. So this is the maritime militia that I was talking about. So they come in large numbers and prevent fishermen from Vietnam or any other country which has staked a claim within this 9 dash line based on the exclusive economic zone, and makes it very difficult for even the coast guards of these countries to take on the maritime militia. So they are paid people, they are like mercenaries, many of them are on the fishing fleet, and they make it extremely difficult. So on one hand, they encourage the Chinese fishermen to fish in disputed territory, and on the other, they do not allow the fishermen from other countries to fish in these disputed areas. They also do not allow any kind of offshore oil exploration or even some kind of a experimentation which is required for by survey ships and scientific research vessels. That is the scenario today. So that in a nutshell tells us about how it's done on South China Sea. The situation is no different in East China Sea. So while the Philippines has won the arguments in the PCA, the point that nobody is coming to its rescue, and it is in fact China, after the verdict was given, was able to buy out the Philippines government through Duterte by investing a lot of money. But even after that, today Philippines is again disillusioned with, despite the heavy investments that China has made, and has made a lot of noise to say that I'm not happy with what is happening in my backyard. So how it will turn out, we'll have to wait because China, as we know, is very good in biding for time and striking when it's convenient. So let's now look at the Blue Water Navy, of which the carrier battle group is an integral component, and which is what it has tried to achieve in the last 15-20 years. So before we go on to what China is doing, of course, I'll just flash these slides to tell you this is the first aircraft carrier, 16, which is basically Variag, which was converted after a considerable effort. And this is 17, Shandong, which is operational. And of course, what you see at the bottom over here, this one is the third aircraft carrier, which is under construction. And there are high expectations about this, of which I'll talk about it. Before that, let's examine the concept of operations, which is common to any blue water navy. Remember, both China and India are now operating the carriers in the Indo-Pacific area. The Chinese aircraft carriers have not still crossed the Straits of Hormuz, and they are not coming to the Indian Ocean region. But we know that their intention is to come into the Indian Ocean region to protect the trade routes and to protect their commercial investments, which have been done along the Maritime Silk Route, of which we will talk about a little later. So as far as the concept of operations are concerned, what we must remind ourselves is that way back in 1961, India commissioned its first carrier, INS Vikrant. And we are very proud to say that during the Swarnim Varsham, which was celebrated this year, the carrier played a significant role in liberation of Bangladesh. So INS Vikrant was there in the forefront, operating in Bangladesh. And so the concept of operations when it comes to the Indian Navy has become integral, and we are quite tuned to the way in which a carrier is deployed. China is new to the game, but they are quick learners, and they are out there at the moment confining the activities of the carrier to within the Western Pacific, more importantly within the South China Sea. And it's only a question of time before we know that they'll be venturing out into the Indian Ocean region. So we only within the next couple of years we'll find that they are going to come out. So when you look at the US carrier battle group, the dozen of them which are there, each of them a behemoth of 100,000 tons, which is a floating city carrying hundreds of fighters and a mix of aircraft, AW aircraft, helicopters, SEALs, commando helicopters, missile systems. So it's an integrated sterile zone that is created around it, which also includes the submarines which carry out sanitization ahead of the carrier area. So this is a highly sophisticated game when it comes to the US Navy, which has been deploying the carrier force around the world. Whereas for China, it is something which is new, and we will expect that they will take a little longer to integrate all the elements of a blue water navy to be efficient as a cattle barrier group. So they started off with Variag, which is shown over here, and they started off with the J-15s, which is the aircraft, because of the fact that this, as you see over here, they are using what's called the short takeoff but arrested recovery, STOBAR. That's called the STOBAR concept. Whereas when you look at the Carrier 3, you find it is a flat deck, just like Vikrant was when it was inducted. And like all the carrier aircraft, so you'll have two catapults over here. And there is also a third catapult which is shown over here. So this will be a combination of EMALS as an electromagnetic system instead of the steam launched catapult system. And that is supposed to give you phenomenal amount of payload carrying capacity for the fixed wing aircraft, which is planned to be degraded over here. And in this diagram, you will also see that there is one aircraft which is standing over here, which is the fixed wing AEW. That becomes very important because the shore-based airborne warning and control system aircraft will not be able to reach out to all the areas. Let's say, for example, the Chinese aircraft carrier is in the Indian Ocean region. So it will be a phenomenal amount of distance at which the AEW or AWACS aircraft will have to provide it. Just like the the Vikramaditya of India, they also carry the Ka-31, the Camo 31 aircraft, which is giving them the AWA car. They also the Ka-27s, like we also use it in the Indian Navy. So there is a certain amount of similarity in terms of the Soviet lineage or the Russian lineage now, which forms the air component of this carrier, whether it is Vikramaditya or whether it is the carriers which are now operating in the Western Pacific. So remember, in the case of INS Vikramaditya, we have gone on to the STOBAR, the short takeoff but arrested recovery. In the case of Vikrant, we again went for STOVL concept, the short takeoff but vertical landing concept by using the Harriers. Initially, they were using the Alizé aircraft and the Seahawk aircraft, which are launched using the steam-based catapult. And when it became time for the platform to be changed, when you changed over from the Seahawks to the Sea Harriers, we went on to the concept. We built in this ramp, which is there on our own carrier, which is now a standard feature. And that is where the Harriers were used till they were decommissioned, until Vikramaditya came in with the MiG-29, the naval version. So that, in a nutshell, is the concept of operations of a carrier battle group, which is an independent entity, which carries with its own protection. And the protection consists of submarine ships and its own integral aircraft, also time shore-based aircraft, and also satellites which are providing real-time information. Like in our own case, we have our own satellite-based information system using the Rukmini. It is not a secret, it's in the public domain. So we use these satellites for enhancing the coverage of naval units which are deployed at extended ranges. Coincidentally, as I am talking today, 26th to 29th, we had the Malabar exercise, the 25th edition of Malabar exercise going on of Guam, and our own P-8I, the aircraft which are based on the Boeing platform, which have done an excellent job, including during the standoff with China, are operating right now in support of the Quad forces operating from all the 4 countries, India, Japan, Australia, and USA. And the level of exercises there have been enhanced manifold, so which includes live firing, which includes complex maneuvers of the 4 partner units which are there. And this includes surface, subsurface, and, like I said, satellite integrated units which are operating to see how they can optimize and synergize on the assets that they have. So let's come to this carrier which is there. While the Varyag and the Varyag-based carrier called the Liaoning, and the Shandong, which is the 17 PL Navy 17, this will be PL 18, which you can see the marking out there. And this is expected to be closer to the Ford class carriers, something like 75,000-80,000 tons, with a good mix of aircraft. And what is noticeable is that they have modified the bridge system, and so that there is no interference between the bridge for maneuvering the ship and another island surface for controlling of the aircraft, what we call FLICO, flying control. So that's the kind of area which has been achieved. It's not very clear in this picture because this is a drawing which was there. But what has come out is that there will be no interference between the bridge, which is used for maneuvering as a command control platform, whereas the FLICO, which will be at a distance away from here, will give you the capability for controlling aircraft in a complex scenario. And they have also been able to optimize on the flight deck, and they are able to carry an additional 10 fighter aircraft because of the optimizations that they have achieved on the flight deck. So you can see how some of this optimization is common to all the 3 aircraft. You can see this slide aircraft. So this is where the wings are folded, the J-15 aircraft, and it's expected that you're going to have the advanced aircraft, including the stealth aircraft, the 31, which are likely to be integrated from the carrier 3 onwards. That's why 18 onwards. 19, 20, 21, there are high expectations that it could even be nuclear propelled. Whether it will also be a number 3 is still a speculation. But the point is that they would like to mirror the carrier force of PLA Navy on the lines of the US Navy. What you must remember here is that even Russia depended, Soviet Union depended heavily on the nuclear submarines. And they did not look at the carriers. It's only much later that they said that if you have to be a global power with a capability for, carrying out your missions across the globe on all the oceans, you require a carrier fleet. Submarines are limited. While they'll provide you a strategic deterrence, but they'll be limited in your ability for carrying out the kind of missions that a blue water navy is required to perform. So the Soviets also, moved on to the carriers. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, of course, some of these which were unfinished also started finding their way elsewhere. Even Varyak, for that matter, was an unfinished carrier from Ukraine. And China, full credit to them for not just the Varyak, but they started off with HMA's Melbourne, an Australian carrier which was taken over by them, and they experimented with that as a platform for a floating hotel. But finally, the intention was very clear. Their intentions were clear 15 to 18 years ago that they would like to have a carrier, a fleet just like the Americans. And they worked very assiduously. When you look at the time frame in which these have been achieved, it is highly creditable. The shipbuilding industry there has come of age, and for the very first time, they dismantled Varyak altogether. They dismantled HMAS Melbourne altogether. So they were able to get, of course, a lot of this is also because of many of these blueprints and diagrams which are smuggled into China by people who are operating from USA, Australia, UK, and other places. And that accelerated their ability to put out a carrier to sea with the Liaoning, and which has been operational for 5-6 years now. So you can see that this is how it's configured. So the entire deck space has also been optimized in the case of 18, that is the third carrier. Emals have been brought in there, which will increase the payload. That means the aircraft which are presently taking off with lesser payload because of the ramp restrictions are in a position to take off because of the additional capability of the emal. So now let's look at how they want to keep the carrier force of an America well beyond the second island chain. Now you might have even a third island chain because of the capability that we keep talking about as denial, area denial weapons. So all of you are familiar with the famous DF-21 and the DF-26 missiles with a stated capability of hitting a moving aircraft carrier with a capability for mid-course guidance using satellites and a terminal homing thereafter to hit a carrier at distances of 2000 kilometers plus. But obviously, so this is of course how they imagine a carrier to be struck. And whereas the US Navy has carried out many exercises, they used an old carrier to determine its seaworthiness, and they found out that it's very difficult to sink a carrier, and also with the kind of the advanced technology that's available today and the protection system, the US, it is not that it's going to be a sitting duck. So even the very missile batteries which are going to launch these DF-21s themselves could be knocked out in the initial phases. So I'm not going to the tactics of how one would neutralize the other or how there would be a surprise element. But what after you sink once, in the extreme case, let's say one of the US carrier is sunk. Is it the end of the game? Because there are 10 more. So are you going to shrink all of them? And is America going to sit quiet? So there are scenarios which are already being worked out. I'm not going to all the details, because of time constraints, but these are available, including in open domain, on the scenario building and including ops research and operational analysis, which has worked out scenarios on how American carrier fleet can safeguard its interests and still pose threats. So we are not going to discount the threat that's going to come because of the DF-21 or DF-26, but everything must be taken with a pinch of salt and with a sort of lot of realism that's thrown into the combat potential of your adversary. As we always inform our young researchers in Chennai Center for China Studies, don't look at China as a 10 feet tall giant, nor look at him as a 3 feet dwarf. Look at him in the eye, which is what we've done along the LAC. So we need to be able to evaluate the capability of adversary and have your plans, contingency plans. And so therefore, it's important to know, yes, there is a real and present danger, to use a cliched phrase, but we need to be prepared both in case of the American fleet that has got many interests in the Western Pacific, and in the case of India, which has similar or more interests in the Indian Ocean region, of which I'll talk a little later. Now, this is just an imaginative picture that's been put out by the Chinese media to say this is how they will neutralize an American carrier by using their long-range missiles. Right. So I would like to leave also some time for all the question answers. So where does that bring us in terms of a comprehensive analysis? So let's make it very clear to all of us that Chinese dream today synchronizes with the Xi's dream to replace USA as the #1 power. So in the economic domain, in the political domain, in the strategic domain, it wants to be recognized as a global player of relevance. And they also would like to meet specific targets. They would like to be technologically competent by 2025. They would like to achieve certain other targets of a moderately prosperous society by 2030. They also would, by 2049, 100 years, they would like to perhaps replace USA and be a global power of importance. So, and also, you would have heard this term very often to say that we are going to build a China with special characteristics. Now, this can be interpreted in any which way. So, again here, it's all a question of what suits the Chinese authorities in trying to build this China with special characteristics. Again, their lost Middle Kingdom as ordained by the heavens. Even today, many of us talk about it, write about it on their fixation with the Middle Kingdom syndrome. To them, they are the Middle Kingdom, and the Chinese emperor, at the moment is Xi, who is anointed as a leader for life, is the one who is ordained by the heavens above to be at the center of the universe and take charge of all the rest who are out there, who are mortals. Heavy investments along the BRI. In 2013, this is of course something we also call it as old wine in new bottle. Civilizations, trade flourished during the old ancient Silk Road along the Central Asian Republic and also through the sea routes. It also saw the spread of Buddhism. And in 2013, when Xi announced his plans for the then called the Silk Road Economic Belt, SREB, and the One Belt, One Road, differently called. Now, of course, it's known as the Belt Road Initiative. And phenomenal amount of investments have been made. Countries have been identified which require investments. Every country requires foreign direct investment, without exception. So they were able to draw out a route which would allow them to expand their market share, use the surplus capacity that was in China to be spread around the world to serve not just the economic interest, but also their long-term geopolitical strategic ambitions. So this must be borne in our mind as to what was the objective of BRI. Right in our neighborhood, you have the China POK economic corridor. I never call it as China-Pakistan economic corridor. I make it a point to always call it as China POK Economic Corridor. It's because it's something where it passes through a territory that belongs to us. So over here, something like $62 billion have been spent, and they are being spent. There are security concerns as well with the Baluchi unrest. And here is where they were trying to also overcome some of the uncertainties related to energy security by connecting Gwadar, which is very close to the Straits of Hormuz, all the way to Xinjiang through gas and oil pipelines from Gwadar and Karachi. So this was another ambition, and Gwadar therefore becomes an important port in their activity schedule. Likewise, Hambantota, where they have invested heavily, thanks to the inability of Sri Lankan regime to repay the loan, Hambantota has been given away for 99 years on lease with phenomenal amount of territory. So it's not that Hambantota, which is next door, is going to be a great threat to India. I'll talk about how we are affected in the Indian Ocean region because of Hambantota, because of its investments in Bangladesh, Myanmar, also in Maldives under the friendly regime of Yamin earlier. And of course, thankfully now with the new democratic regime, things are looking up in our favor. And so therefore, it's important to know that BRI is just not an economic initiative, but it also serves the strategic ambitions and aspirations of China, which would like to capture the markets, provide connectivity across Asia, across continents. It's from Asia to Africa to Europe. They identified, and when you look at the map, it's very clear that the BRI is very important to Xi for expanding the spheres of influence through trade. As we always say in naval circus, flag follows trade, and you've seen that happening. So they come through investments, whether it's the East India Company or the Chinese economic investments. They are the ones who are coming in a big way in our neighborhood. So that has, to a certain extent, destabilized the security stability calculus in the Indian Ocean region. Djibouti, it's important to know what's Djibouti. Djibouti is the first overseas military base that was built. Let's link this up with the carrier program. The satellite images which were taken just a couple of months ago tells us that they already completed a berth which is 320 meters long plus. So when you compare this with the length of the new carriers, both the carriers, they are in a position to berth these carriers out there. That is the military maritime potential of China today. So everything was done with a plan in mind. And over here, it was that they bought Djibouti and they have the capability today to use Djibouti for operating their aircraft carrier, for turning them around. So its turning around is not fueling and providing rest and recreation to your troops, but it's also the ability to carry out limited repairs, dry docking if required, and for also providing the arms, ammunition, and have a storage house that will support the carrier in its mission. Therefore, Djibouti, which all the analysts were looking at, including us in India, has become an important stop post for China in overcoming what's called the tyranny of distance, which I'll cover a little later. So along the BRI, if you invested heavily, if you got $62 billion in China POK Economic Corridor, if you have total of $1 trillion earmarked for FDI along all the countries, including up to Europe, particularly Italy and others, obviously you would like to protect it. We've already seen how Chinese have been attacked in their investment areas in Pakistan. So there is a real threat, a real danger, and tomorrow this threat could emerge in the maritime dimension, which is where they would like to address the issue of an ability to carry out forward posturing and have a presence in areas of interest, just on the lines as what America is doing today. They have a carrier force. Where required, they'll send out 2 carriers. or 3 carriers if required. So that is the ability that a carrier battle group provides to the country that hosts it as part of the Blue Water Navy. So remember, way back in 2005, the Paris emissions picked up, and China used it as an excuse. It was required. There was also a certain amount of legitimacy to protect your trade interests. So China, India, and everyone was operating their units. And I must tell you that over 370 odd missions have been carried out by PLA Navy units. Every time there would be either 2 or 1 combat unit which would be operating along the African coast, carrying out anti-piracy missions. So it should not be dismissed as just anti-piracy missions. Please remember, what they have been able to do is to build up a database in these 370 odd missions in the last 15 years plus. And that is the data that gives them a bathymetric data, the shipping data, the kind of complexities that are involved in the African coast, the ability to operate from Djibouti, the ability to intercept and use their assets, including from friendly navies like Pakistan, Turkey, or Iran, for safeguarding their interests, is where should be not dismissed as just anti-piracy missions, but this was done to a plan. And they were able to build up a phenomenal amount of database which has gone into there. So the bathymetric data that's required for designing their sonars and weapons, and for tomorrow identifying potential targets, and by their signature. Today, every submarine, every ship has a signature which can be stored in your database, and using AI, you would be able to even launch your weapons. That is what we need to understand as analysts, to say that this is the kind of complex environment that China was able to decipher to a large extent by using anti-piracy missions for its database and for analysis. The carrier program in assessment is totally on track. In fact, they were ahead of their time schedules. And so looking at the past track record, it's quite possible that they will have another 3 carriers. I'm talking about 3 plus 3. And the next 3, there will again be no surprises if they will use nuclear propulsion, a DMAL, and a mix. And it will perhaps be a mirror image of the 90 to 100,000 ton carriers that America has today. There will be no surprises. That would give it a capability for out of the South China Sea operations, out of the West Pacific operations, which means you are looking at the Indian Ocean region now. So you can definitely look at the Catabar type facility on them, and you will have them. So let's look at some more. We'll continue to face issues of vulnerable long supply chains. This is something that geography has not given any kind of advantage to China. It remained mostly a coastal navy, and today, when it wants to come out to Indian Ocean region to protect its interests, it has to travel something like 10 to 15,000 kilometers, depending on where it starts from. And then it has to pass through the muster at the Straits of Hormuz and Singapore. Then it has to pass through the Andaman Sea, or it has to avoid and skirt the Andaman Sea altogether, and it takes a long detour. And then it comes around into its area of operation. It's not easy to have such a long supply vulnerable chain. And this is what we would like to look at it as a tyranny of distance or the curse of distance of the PLA Navy, or even its Blue Water Navy units, to be able to make its forays into Indian Ocean region. So which is what explains why they would like to overcome this limitation by having bases in Djibouti, in Gwadar, in Hambantota, and of course in other African countries. There's been a certain amount of setback to their BRI ambitions, mainly because of debt trap diplomacy, and that would come in the way of their dreams in terms of having support of the local governments. And that's something that we should factor into our calculations when Indian Navy would like to take on the challenges of this extra regional power in our backyard. Indian Navy in my assessment, continues to enjoy a geographical advantage on both flanks, both in the Arabian Sea and also in the Bay of Bengal. Bay of Bengal is where we were able to win our naval war in 1971. But there are increased challenges with the kind of cooperation that exists between PLA Navy and the Pakistan Navy. So you find that the threat dimensions in the North Arabian Sea have changed, and we need to factor it. Luckily, the complete nature and complexity of the units that we operate in the Indian Navy is also increasing manifold. We got the Scorpion submarines. We are getting the advanced helicopters, which are capable of both underwater warfare and anti-ship carrying anti-ship missiles. So they're going to be coming here, the 60s. And then on the other side, we have the PADIs, the ones which have proved their worth. We're going to have 20 of them. As of now, I think just last month, before that, we had the 11th PADI landing in India. In fact, the tie that I'm wearing today is from INS Rajali, which operates this base. And I was honored to be the first commanding officer of that base. So it is with great pride that I displayed this tie today. And the surveillance potential of Indian Navy has been showed up by induction of PADI MRSW. It also serves as an elite aircraft, and it was very active during the LAC, with its mapping capability, with its SAR radar, there's a synthetic aperture radar. They were able to fix ground positions, and there's a great demand by the Army and the Air Force for providing these kind of inputs to the forces out there. So we're very happy that there is synergy amongst the three services to provide what is required for the services to keep the PLA, Army, the Air Force, and the Navy at bay. The surveillance potential of Indian Navy, like I said, has gone up manifold. And please also include the satellites, which are working dedicatedly for providing the communication facilities and transference of real-time picture. The Malabar, which concludes today or has concluded today, had all these assets as I brought out earlier. And this 4 days exercise, what they're going to bring out is going to be more important today, because earlier on it was a very loose kind of a alliance, and with partners who are not very committed. Australia, India, each for their own reason. But thanks to the post-COVID scenario, there is a newfound resolve to ensure that the Quad delivers. So I have always made it a point to tell people that we should not look at what Quad cannot be, but we need to look at what Quad can be. And that has been proved by looking at the vaccine diplomacy, looking at the initiatives for resilience supply chain initiative, for improving the climate change. So you can see what all can be added to in the Quad format, and without trying to make it look like a NATO alliance. And that's important to us, important to all the partners, particularly with the belligerent China, which is trying to fire on all cylinders to make it difficult for countries like Australia, for Taiwan, for a small country like Palau, and even a very small European country like Lithuania, where it is broken. So these are signals which have been made. So I would like to continue to have a lot of hope on what the Quad can give us in terms of our potential to deal with this aggressive neighbor that we have. So what is the conclusion? PLA Navy, which is now bigger than US Navy in terms of numbers. So don't be carried away by numbers, because it is not all about quality and battle experience. PLA Navy has not fought a major war, particularly in the sea domain. So the last time, whatever skirmishes they had with Vietnam others, their noses have been bloodied. So it's not just the numbers. While numbers are important, please also remember that if you've gone the long hog to create your assets in South China Sea, mainly with the view of expanding your exclusive economic zone, you will have to start protecting all these ill-gotten wealth, whether it is the rock which has been converted into a military base, or a shoal that only comes up during low water, has now been, by using extensive dredging, has been converted into a artificial island. It is not going to give you an exclusive economic zone. So I'd like to correlate this with the first part of my talk. So to tell us that UNCLOS is very clear. It's Article 56, or whether it's many of the other control related provisions. When you have, it allows any nation to build an island, but that island does not give an exclusive economic zone around it. All that it gives is you have 12 nautical miles. That must be made very clear. Whereas by using the 9 dashed line, China would like to claim the entire area as a South China Lake that only belongs to China based on some distorted historical evidence and its own interpretation of when it ruled these islands for generations, 2000 years. So, when it comes to China, it can invent this. It will also give you maps which tells you that the whole of the world was ruled by Chinese emperors in the past. So, India will, of course, like I said, the carrier, you will soon see them in Indian Ocean region. Let there be no surprises. When they come here, they would like to test out the concept of being able to operate at such extended distances, just like the US Navy does. Please remember, it's easy for the US Navy to carry out such operations off Guam or in the Western Pacific with the kind of friends that they have, either in Singapore or Philippines or wherever. Whereas China, we can count the number of friends that they have. So let's bear this in mind, and let's not overcredit his capability. Let's not underestimate him. Let's not overestimate him. Let's carry out a factual analysis before trying to say what it holds for us in the Indian Ocean region. India will, of course, need to work on all contingencies. So it's all about contingency planning. While it has stood firm and looked the PLA in the eye along the LAC, the maritime domain offers creditable leverages that we can apply, and more so when the Quad is acting together. This is what China is afraid of. On the face of it, when the Quad was thrown into the entire matrix, so many Chinese analysts tried to dismiss it as saying that is something that will vaporize in no time. The same Chinese leadership today is going to Bangladesh and saying that you should not join the Quad. So why would you go around telling people not to join Quad if you are not rattled by the potential of such partnership? So this is something we should use. So it is unknown that these four democracies are come together. Together they are able to provide that kind of a front, not just at the military level, but in the political dimension and the economic dimension, and in a restructured world post-COVID. That is what is bringing jitters to China. We've also seen how some of their recent measures have made them lose their market potential. A lot of people are now looking at India as the second most favorable destination for moving out, for establishing their enterprise. So China is paying a price for its adventurism, and we should not lose sight of this fact when you are looking at what it can do. We should also try and examine and see what it cannot do because of what it has created for itself post COVID, and also its handling of the COVID itself and its vaccine diplomacy. Today, the first-hand reports from Mauritius is telling us that a lot of Mauritius nationals who took Sinpac, the Chinese vaccine, have been seriously affected. So no, these are factors that people are closely watching. They are showing a preference now for Covaxin and Covishield. So there is a need to create facilities for basing of modern submarines. This I'm very, very fond of. The naval leadership is aware of this, but it's for us to ensure that the geographic advantage that they have, a blessing that we have in terms of an outpost in the form of 542 islands from north to south in Andaman Nicobar, with Car Nicobar having the ability for turning ground, even strategic lift aircraft and supporting fighter base. I would expect this to be there on a permanent basis. Modern submarines, nuclear submarines, modern aircraft, and everybody else. I would expect them to be positioned on a permanent basis and not lose out this opportunity and surrender our advantage that we have in being so close to the Singapore Straits. Everybody knows that the Indira Point, which is the southernmost point of India, is a stone's thrown away from Indonesia. These are the factors that we need to work to. So, yeah, sorry, that is, I come to the last but one slide. There is need to create facilities in not only Andaman Nicobar. I would also like to say that we must also create them in Lakshadweep Minicoy. Some of this is already happening. So both on the western front in Arabian Sea and in the Bay of Bengal, you have forward posts, active, alert, ready to strike. There's also a need to have at least one more carrier. There's a debate ongoing in India. Please remember that if we accepted the fact that both the Eastern Fleet and the Western Fleet should have a carrier each, the third carrier is required because that's one when it's undergoing refit or there is a contingency. So only if you have three carriers would you be in a position to maintain this optimal requirement, which is minimal. Now we'd obviously bat for more, but the economic conditions are such we can't go around building carriers like the America has done or China is planning to do. But I would bat for at least having three carriers so that continuously you are having a carrier, a carrier battle group with each fleet to carry out our missions, particularly when this extra regional player is trying to make a mark in the Indian Ocean region in our neighborhood, and that's important. So with that, I come to the end of my conclusion and also my uh, grateful acknowledgement to all the participants who are here. Thank you very much, and I'm open to questions. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much indeed, Commodore Wasson. I'm sorry I was not able to join the meeting from the beginning because of some technical problems. I was able to join using my cell phone. So thank you very much indeed for such a lucid presentation. Couple of things I will raise before we go on to questions from the audience. Number one, China exploited the situation of Somalian pirates to get themselves a foothold in Indian Ocean. But even before they developed their base, military base in Djibouti, they had an agreement for refueling and recuperation with Seychelles. And that agreement was signed in December of 2011. Also, we need to keep in mind that Hu Jintao in 2009 had openly declared that PLAN and PLA need to be prepared for a war to safeguard China's ocean sovereignty. And that's the time when China decided to make its commercial fleet, its mercantile fleet, dual purpose. All the mercantile vessels, including fishing vessels, were retrofitted to make them actually seaworthy and become like, for maritime warfare. So the point I'm raising is that China does a very deep thinking and very deep planning. It is not just Xi Jinping, so when we talk about continuity, Hu Jintao was talking about it. Deng, of course, talked about, bide for your time, keep on building your strength. So whether Xi Jinping is here or not tomorrow, whoever is going to be the general secretary of Chinese Communist Party will continue to have the same megalomaniac delusion that they are at the center of the world and the ruler of China is ordained from the heaven to rule the world. And I think that is the factor we need to take into when we are planning for our own capabilities. If we leave aside Quad, which is not really a reliable, ally as an institution, looking at its history, what should be India's strategic response in terms of developing our own maritime capability, a blue water navy? You did talk about the third aircraft carrier. Some of us say that to deal with the Chinese challenge in 2049, India will require at least 6 carriers. We are not talking about today. We are not talking about tomorrow. Our second carrier program, took 15 or 16 years to develop, second carrier. So when we are talking about timing of that scale, I think 3 may not be enough. Probably we'll have to look at the Chinese developments in 2049, and we have to plan accordingly rather than for tomorrow or day after tomorrow. And instruments like Quad are really not reliable. And you know that with what happened in Afghanistan. The leader changes in the United States, the whole thinking changes. So India has to develop its own maritime warfare capability and deal with the challenge because China has pretty much become an Indo-Ocean power. Commodore Watson, please.
All valid points, Dr. Aditya ji, and thanks for adding on to what I've said. I mean, there can be no gainsaying as far as this issue is concerned to say that we must be a maritime capable nation. Unfortunately, due to various reasons, we also look at the fact that we are just about a $3 trillion economy, whereas in comparison, we are looking at China, which is 5 times
Yes.
that capacity, $15 trillion. Of course, America is at about $21 trillion, which is still ahead of it. The point is that unless you have built up your comprehensive maritime power, which is not the Navy alone, because it also requires all the components of the blue economy. We also require a strong merchant navy. It's unfortunate that today India does not even have 1% of the global shipping volumes to talk about merchant navy, whereas the manpower is substantial. We have about 14% of Indian seafarers who are manning ships around the world. But today, when the same Indian seafarer goes to China, on various flimsy reasons, they are stopped from going into China or coming out from China. So this is the kind of pressure tactics that apply to even affect the 14% seafarers that we are using. So yes, I agree that we need to be on our own. Yes, the recent developments in Afghanistan have told us that US perhaps is not a reliable ally. We have to continue perhaps till everybody talks about the Atmanirbharata. The point is it will take a long while. The aircraft that we are talking about today, the PADI is coming from America. The helicopters, anti-submarine helicopters are coming from America. The Vikramaditya came from Russia. The MiG-29. So when you look at the inventory, it tells us that to bridge this gap, we will take at least a decade, provided there is money, there is effort, and there is willingness on part of the leadership. It's a hard process. We all understand this. So, no, we should not be under the illusion that we can make everything on our own tomorrow. You look at our inventory, it tells us we are dependent either on Russia or France for Rafales and submarines, or Israel for some of the high-tech equipment, or for weaponry from the West. So if this is the scenario today, so we need to work to a plan. No, we can't be dependent, eternally dependent on these kind of supplies, which only keeps the military industrial complex elsewhere singing. We would like to move away from that. Yes, we have success stories in our indigenization plans, but they cannot be just a flash in the fry pan. It has to be much more. So I take your point that we need to be a lot more concerned about the total lack of comprehensive maritime power, which includes all the components of blue economy. I'm not looking at the Navy. Navy is capable today. We are capable of taking on and protecting all our interests. The fact that our surface, subsurface, and air units are operating off GOAM tells us that we have that kind of a reach, capability, capacity, and intent. But all this will take little more time before we can come of age, and that's a hard process. So I would like to request Director General Admiral Chauhan, who is here, before I respond to the other questions, to come in, because he just recently written an article on the carriers. Admiral Chauhan, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Listening with great interest to your very succinct presentation. So first of all, I'd like to offer you my congratulations. I would like also to address the point that was raised by Mr. Adityanji, in that, China plays what we call the long game. And China, when you are looking at strategic surprise, the days are gone where you could be surprised strategically in spatial terms. That means in terms of distance or place. But you can certainly be taken by complete strategic surprise in temporal terms over time. So if China's short term is longer than India's long term, then China will keep its eye on the ball while India will keep its eye on successive elections.
Yes.
And therefore, we will be forced, regrettably, to engage even as a powerful nation in a series of eureka moments of saying, "Arey, ye kya ho gaya? Arey, ye kaise ho gaya?" This is because our ability to look at the long term with concentration is defeated by the very adjective long in the word long term. As soon as you say long term, urgency goes out of the window. Therefore, China and all authoritarian regimes which have tenure stability will enjoy this kind of advantage. Democracies enjoy other advantages. But if the democracy concerned starts to try to gain the advantage of an autocracy, it will generally fall between both stools. And consequently, our ability to keep our eye on the ball and to actually not ape Western, American, or any other European perceptions and concepts, but to actually devise our own, requires to be placed on the front burner, not at government, but at every level of concerned Indian society, which constitutes our polity as a whole. I also want to mention with respect to the carrier, lots of noise is made about carriers and the ability to have 2, 3, 5, 10 as a function of money. I have commanded a carrier myself, and I can tell you a few things about this. Any country with enough money can buy, say, a strike corps of the army. But to learn how to deploy that strike corps in battle takes 25 years. Any country can build or buy aircraft carrier. But to learn how to deploy a carrier battle group in conflict takes 25 years. And every time you make a mistake, yes, you can replace the aircraft. Yes, you can replace even the ship. How will you replace 25 years of or 20 years of training required to produce a master green pilot? And every time you lose one, there is an impossibility of making up that, because that time cannot be compressed. I know that this is not my talk, so I won't take too much of your time, except to say that therefore we continue to have a window of opportunity. We would be foolish in the extreme were we to decide that we want to take our carrier groups. I keep saying this carrier battle group, and I'm very pleased that Commodore Vasan, who is miles senior to me, also uses the word, because too many people talk about the carrier as if it can be taken independently. So just like you cannot take a tank, sirs or ladies, and then talk about the chassis separately and the turret separately. In the same way, you cannot talk about the carrier separately and its group separately. It is one synergistic fighting machine. And if we cannot have enough imagination to even understand that the components need not be physically connected so as to make a fighting machine, then we are defeated anyway by lack of imagination. Fine. So therefore, while the Chinese can deploy all their carriers and carrier groups comfortably in the South China Sea, this is because they have diversionary airfields available within 50 to 60 to 100 miles. Come to the Indian Ocean and deploy at 500 miles away. Then let's see what happens. When your pilot runs into grief or your aircraft runs into grief, I'm afraid it's going to be glug, glug, glug. There is no land on which to position there's no diversionary airfield available. So that is one point. Last point, with regard to Gwadar. I think that there is the strategic community needs to go into a little more detail before pontificating about whether or not Gwadar is a problem. Gwadar has been dredged right now in 2020 September, and now can take ships of 70,000 deadweight tons. 70,000 deadweight tons is less than the weight of a standard Afra oil tanker. It is less than the depth required for a container carrier, even a 7,000 TEU container carrier. China needs 19,000 TEU container carriers. How are they going to go alongside? Who is studying Gwadar in terms of the depths alongside the effort to make out whether or not it can absorb ships, and therefore determining what is the time available to us? I'm afraid that these sorts of calculations need to be done before we either get alarmed or we become complacent. Basically, to see how much is the time at our disposal that we must spend before China is able to utilize Gwadar or any other base, because remember that there's a huge difference between a base and a place. Djibouti is a place. In times short of conflict, many things can be done with a place. In times of conflict, you need to be able to defend a base. How will you defend a base which is 8,500 miles away from you? I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Commodore Vasan. Once again, let me congratulate you. I, of course, could carry on in this vein for a long time, but I'm grateful for the indulgence that you've given. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much
Admiral
indeed, Admiral Chauhan, for your comments. Again, for both our esteemed speaker, Commodore Vasan, and for Admiral Chauhan, talking about short-term and long-term. So China's first aircraft carrier became operational in 2012. If we dig a little back into the history, the way it was acquired was by deception. It was a Ukrainian, designed aircraft carrier, which was not completely renovated, and China purchased in 1999 using a private businessman paying $20 million that he will start a floating casino on this platform. So when China is concerned, deception is the norm rather than the exception. The reason I'm bringing this forth is that you can never trust China. And although we don't want to overestimate them, we really don't want to make the mistake of underestimating them. And I think our long-term planning is based on the political decisions, government of the day. And I think by making repeated mistakes in understanding China, whether on the land border or their intentions in the Indian Ocean or wherever, I think India, in order to have not only maritime capability, but total strategic posture vis-a-vis China, will have to plan long-term and not actually get bogged down into the electoral cycle, which China does not have the liability of. So both for Commodore Watson and Admiral Chauhan, I think my suggestion is that our civil society, our strategic community needs to start talking about these issues so that the government of the day, even if it changes, there is some continuity in decision-making process. Commodore Watson, please.
Thank you very much. I think, both you and Admiral Chauhan have, rounded off this complete discussion as far as I am concerned. But also, there are a few questions which I would like to take up now. Unfortunately, my laptop went off in between, so I don't remember all the questions. So if I do forget, please remind me. There was one question about the kind of advances that have been made by China in underwater robotics and, UUVs, that's unmanned underwater vehicles. And we know that their SNT is quite advanced in some of these areas. They had taken even a submersible to some record depths of below the ocean, up to 7 kilometers plus. And there is enough evidence to say that they had released, even in Indian Ocean region, some robots by their research vessel, which was driven out subsequently. So that capability exists today for converting this into something else. Now, if you have the capability and potential, it's only a question of what you want to use it for later. It can become a weapon system, it can become an intelligence system, it can become something for landing saboteurs, it can be anything. So they do have a capability, and like I said, it must again be factored in. There's another point about the increased use of advanced torpedoes which can sink carriers. That's a very valid observation in the sense that the carriers or for that matter any surface ship is more vulnerable to a torpedo than a missile, because the carriers have multiple thousands of compartments which are watertight, and even if some of them are knocked out, it will perhaps still float. But any underwater attack by a sophisticated high-speed torpedo, which hits, that can be worrisome for any fleet commander and a carrier captain. But which is why, again, going back to the concept of the carrier battle group, you're not going to let a carrier go on its own. You are going to have to sterilize the entire zone for hundreds of miles or 300 miles. So in the case of missiles, if you want to keep the carrier away, you would ensure that the zone is the entire area sterilized up to the maximum range of the missile. In the case of the submarine, you would like to sterilize the underwater domain. By underwater domain awareness means up to the maximum range of an enemy submarine. So these are tactical in nature, so I would not like to go into this. But the point is, yes, you must know what the technical capabilities are and what kind of surprises there can be in terms of a tactical system that's thrown at you. So these are two questions which I remembered. If you could kindly either put it back in the chat box on the ones which are not answered, or you can come up over here if the admin allows them and post the question over here, because it looks like I lost these questions in a changeover of my laptop.
I will read some of the selected questions. Some of the questions that are being asked in the chat function have already been answered. So there is some issue about whether Hambantota or, for that matter, Gwadar can be repurposed for dual use. Do you want to comment on that?
Definitely. I think Admiral Chauhan has already told you about Gwadar to tell us, that it can't be used for everything. Yes, the PLA Navy ships will be there. Perhaps the submarines will be there. but you don't foresee the carrier operating from there because of the restrictions that are available. It may not be in a position to go alongside, but yes, it will use the anchorages like the other merchant ships and be supported from shore, like some of the American carriers were supported off Chennai and here and there. So it's not a big issue. But yes, Admiral Chauhan has a point. If you are trying to look at Hambantota or Gwadar or Djibouti as a potential port that would be put to military use, you must understand what the port has to offer or what can it be modified for in a short time. If it has no, and in a recent article, in an interview to one of the strategic studies group in Trincomalee, I was asked this question about Hambantota. So I bluntly told the interviewer that Hambantota is within the missile striking range of all missiles in the Indian inventory. From Kanyakumari, from Madurai, from Tanjore, from Ramnad, we will be in a position to neutralize Hambantota. So here there was an indirect cautioning that was given to the Sri Lankan authorities to say that at any time if you think of militarizing Hambantota, then you have a price to pay. No, so these are things that we must bear in mind. Yes, you must look at the potential of what Hambantota can do, or what Djibouti can do, or what Gwadar can do for us, and that is factored into your, again, concept of operations during peacetime and during hostilities. Next question, sir.
Okay, so we are actually coming to almost end of questions. People have asked, questions about the BRI and all that have been sort of discussed in the past. There is a question from LV Krishnan, and I'll read the question for you. Surely China must be aware of all the challenges in establishing a BWN in IOR. Ipso facto, they must be examining solutions. What shapes are these likely to take? Anyone looking at these?
Yeah, I think Mr. L.V. Krishnan is again a distinguished member of C3S, and we have wonderful discussions with him every day. So I'm happy he's posed this question. He's very right to say, which is also echoed by Dr. Adityanji, that China knows what they're doing. If they know that these are the limitations in the Indian Ocean region, they will find solutions, which is why they commissioned Djibouti, which is what I brought out to say that they got a 320-meter long berth which is available. You can berth on both sides of this berth. So why were they engaging with the Maldivian government? For this very reason, that they wanted to be able to support their fleet in their missions in the Indian Ocean region, which are related to protecting energy security, which is being relevant on the sea lines of communication, which is being supportive of their investments in countries along the entire maritime Silk Road, and to be able to wield that influence using their maritime power. They already have the maximum number of merchant ships out at sea. So along with the fleet which is out there, it will become a credible maritime power that can wield influence. So which is where the importance of Chinese decision making, their planning, their long-term planning without interruption, irrespective of which government comes into power, because it is one in number CCP, which is one in number leader Xi, anointed for life, who will hold the brief and will ensure that his dreams materialize. So thank you for that question, Mr. Krishnan. But Chinese, I agree with you that Chinese plan for everything. So we need to look at what those plans are and create counters, because, like I said, I'd like to re-emphasize, you are blessed with geography. Let's not surrender that advantage by not acting in good faith, whether it's Port Blair, whether it's Andaman Nicobar chain of islands, or whether it is creating facilities in countries which are given you the equivalent of the Limoa, that is the logistic memorandum with Singapore. Indonesia is ready. Some of other Southeast Asian countries are ready. Let's use this. We must get out of the fear of China. All these years we've been worried about China will be sensitive. Why should we do this? We'll be, angering them. So we should get out of this mold, and only then we'll be able to take on China and deal with it in the manner that's appropriate for a country of our stature.
So there are a couple of other questions which are somewhat away from this particular topic, and I'm not going to take those questions. I'm sorry for our audience for not taking those questions. I will end this program with one last question. Commodore Watson, the Type 004 aircraft carrier that is being planned by China is likely to be nuclear powered. China spent $3 billion in researching a nuclear power plant that can, support the aircraft carrier that is in plan, that is around going to be 80,000 tons and all that sort of thing. Would the third aircraft carrier for India that is still in the planning stage be nuclear powered or not? And should it?
Well, yeah, it should be, because we are also looking at the spin-off technologies. We're not, if you can put a nuclear reactor of 96 kN in a submarine, which is our own, and give us a second strike capability and a strategic deterrence, why not on a nuclear carrier? Because you're also not looking at just whether it's being a nuclear power or whatever. It also will help your EMALs, will allow you to take aircraft which are heavy payload. Will be able to carry the AW type of aircraft which the Chinese are planning to carry on their third carrier and the fourth carrier. Here, there are a lot of questions about, we already named it as Vishal, but there are Vishal number of questions on the third aircraft carrier, which I think we need to be able to address it. If you're planning to be a maritime nation, it's better that we look at the potential that it has, not in just terms of being a carrier, a nuclear powered carrier, but more in terms of the spin-off which was there. The Cochin Shipyard Limited, which had never built a warship of this size before, has moved on to this. It was such a pleasurable sight to see the carrier go out to sea, and during the sea trials, even have a Sea King embark on it. It warms the cockles of your heart. So this is what we should be looking at. So the ancillary industries that will be supported, the kind of additional mechanisms that will come into place in our own shipyards. So we should not be, narrow-minded in this visionary objectives of India, which has to demonstrate to itself that it has the required maritime potential. We have a rich legacy of having been a maritime nation. Not so anymore. So let's reinvent our history and move forward. So I would all out recommend Vishal, but I know there are too many experts who are trying to scuttle it from within and from without.
Thank you, Commodore Watson. Again, I thank all our audience who have taken time on a Saturday, whether in the morning in US or evening in India, for taking time to join this. I'm highly thankful to Commodore Watson for joining us for this program. This is the first program Commodore Watson is joining, and I'm thankful to Admiral Chauhan. We would like to continue this dialogue in one form or the other. We also have roundtable discussions. We continue to work on strategic education, strategic awareness, and this session on maritime preparedness and China's activities has been very useful. I think we have to change the strategic culture in India and educate the political leadership that is governing at the moment. Unfortunately, the democracy does not give you the luxury of continuity of leadership or continuity of the party. So it's an onerous task to educate our civilian leadership and the political class as to why there needs to be continuity on our strategic planning. And I hope with people like Commodore Watson, Admiral Chauhan, we will continue to do our activities. Thank you very much, everyone who participated in this program as an audience. I know not all questions were taken because some of the questions were rather political, so I did not want to bring those questions, but we are going to formally end this discussion. Thank you very much, everyone.